Hey, I'm Nachliel, Selavan, and I have three questions to ask you. Number one, where is the real Armageddon? Number two, how did Aramaic become the language of the Talmud? And number three, why is Assyria the biggest fish? Welcome to Tanach Study and to Archaeology Snapshot. This is Sefer Study, and today we're presenting the second book of Kings, Sefer Melachim II, and I'm really excited to get into it. But before we go into it, I just want to ask you to do that one thing that really helps YouTube channels, and to just hit that like button and that subscribe button so you can follow and get updates and notifications. And those thumbs ups are really going to go a long way in promoting this video and making sure other people see it. So let's get into it. What is the purpose of this episode and of what we're doing in Sefer Study? As you know, the following four questions, which is when is it happening, who are the main players, where is it going on, and some highlights from history and archaeology. And we have so much to do today, so without further ado, let's get straight into the British Museum in London. The basic divide between Melachim Aleph and Melachim Bet, even though it's kind of hard to give it a serious definition since these are really, Christian divisions, it has to do with the end of the house of Omri, because basically the end of Melachim Aleph has to do with Eliyahu Hanavi moving on and appointing Elisha to do his job, and he appoints Hazael to be the king of Aram and Yehu ben Nimshi to be the king of Israel, and to get rid of the remainder of the house of Omri and his son Achav. And that's what's going to start happening right off the bat in the beginning of Melachim Bet. And that's very much relevant to the archaeology in the British Museum. And I'd like to start with one very important artifact, which you're looking straight at right now at the entrance to the Assyrian galleries. And it's an obelisk, and it's black. And so it has a very creative name in archaeology, and it's called the Black Obelisk. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you the Black Obelisk of King Shalmaneser III. Now, you know of Shalmaneser, who exiled the 10 tribes. We're going to get to him later, but that's Shalmaneser V. Shalmaneser III is from the Assyrian kingdom before they became an empire, so it's not as important to us for our story. The only reason it is important to us here is because there's a picture on top of this obelisk, in the very top, of King Yehu. It's actually second register from the top, of King Yehu ben Nimshi bowing down and paying tribute to the king of Assyria. And this is an extra-biblical story, extra-biblical meaning it doesn't show up in Tanach. We don't know anything about it, but it mentions Yehu as Ben Omri. In other words, this is what's called the eponymous ruler. It's the name of the founder of the dynasty of that kingdom. And so in the ancient Near Eastern custom, you attribute a king to the kingdom he is part of. And so if he's a legitimate king, as the Assyrian Empire must have thought he was, they call him Ben Omri, even though he's really Yehu ben Nimshi. Now, speaking of Nimshi, I would like to direct your attention to a very important excavation of a northern Israeli site in the area of Emek Yisrael, which is the area in which the story of Yehu ben Nimshi, as we'll see soon, takes place, and that is the excavation of Telerikhov. Now, this was a very beautiful exhibition, which they found there an apiary. They found beehives and a bee factory, honey factory, from this period of time, from the Iron Age, and so that's why this is called Dvash Melachim. The catalog is called the Honey of Kings. But what's important in Telerikhov, I'd like you to see exactly where it is, so you can get the idea that it's very much relevant to our story and our setting of who Yehu ben Nimshi is. It's the find of the name Nimshi on the site. So on the site they found many different things, including these jars. And jars would generally be inscribed, as we're going to see later as well. Jars are inscribed, they're used for transportation, they have to belong to somebody, and on it was etched on the clay the name Nimshi, or there's several different variations of Nimshi, but that basically means that the family of Nimshi was found in the region from the period of time, which is fascinating. But in addition to that, Yehu ben Nimshi was sent to destroy the house of Omri, the house of Achav, as we shall see. And indeed, the name Achav, as you can see, was also found on the handle of a jug, which is very important. Kings would write their names on the handles of jugs for tax collecting purposes, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. Our next highlight is understanding the big picture of this period of time, which is Iron Age II. Now remember, Iron Age II begins with the unified monarchy with David and Shlomo. We have the split of the kingdom. Now we are well into Iron Age II, and Iron Age II actually ends at the end of Sefer Melachim Bet. It ends with the destruction of the Bet HaMikdash. Now again, remember that these ages are very local, so Iron Age II in Israel, in Judah, that is what ends it, even though there is settlement that sort of continues. But that's a very traumatic experience in the region, which is why the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash in 586 BCE, according to conventional chronology, is the end of Iron Age 2. And I would like to call this age the Age of Empires. Of course, Oded Lipschitz of Tel Aviv University actually has a book called Age of Empires discussing this, but I got the idea from the computer game, and that's the name of the very first tour that I started doing in the museum, and you're going to hear about that in the end because it's very exciting. And this opportunity, if you haven't clicked the like button yet, please click that like button. Thank you very much. Now, what exactly do I mean the Age of Empires? So we have regional kingdoms, which look at the map, that's Malchut Yehuda, we have Malchut Israel, and then we have a big player in our neighborhood, which is called Egypt, Mitzrayim, and we have the Tzidonim, we have the Arameans, we have Ammon, we have Moab, right? That's all very nice. These are regional kingdoms. They are city-states. They're a king with a territorial area that they control, and they make coalitions against each other, working with each other back and forth and back and forth. They make alliances, but these are all regional kingdoms. An empire is a completely different thing. It's a different administrative structure which manages to control many different kingdoms underneath it in what's called a vassal state, a vassal kingdom or a puppet kingdom, and we're going to see that coming into play very, very soon in the region, but it's a different administrative structure, and so an emperor in Tanach is called Melech HaMelachim, the King of Kings. We're going to get a lot more into that later with Daniel and in Treasar perhaps, and we'll see more in Ketuvim perhaps, but that is where the song for Shabbat, Mi Melech Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, is actually referring to those words, those psukim saying Hashem is the King of the Kings of Kings. So the new empire on the block, the new bully on the block is, of course, Ashur. But in the Age of Empires, we're going to end with Bavel, and we're going to actually go into Shivat Zion. Of course, we have a few Sfarim to cover before we get there, but that's going to be with the Persian Empire in Shushan HaBirah. So we are entering the Age of Empires. That's part of what's happening in Melachim Bet. Now, our important story kicking off Sefer Melachim Bet, which in terms of archaeology is in Perek Gimel, which is Mesha Melech Moav. The overview of the story of Mesha Melech Moav is very straightforward. Moav was subjugated by Achav and Omri, and once they died, he was able to sort of shake off their yoke and to retaliate and to cause us damage. That's pretty much all we know, is that he stopped paying taxes. We know that he was from Dibon. We know that he was a shepherd. He was a Noked. Fine. Now we have Shomron and we have Yehuda, right? We have these kings who get together. We have Yehoshaphat, etc., and they go together with Melech Edom, and together they go to fight against Mesha Melech Moav. That's the story that we have. It ends in a sort of hiatus where we don't exactly know what happened, where Mesha goes to the top of the wall and he kills the son of another king. Not getting into that. What's exciting is the discovery in the late 1860s in the city of Dibon in Moab, which is this black stela called the Moabite stone, or the Mesha Stela. Now, the Moabite stone, there's a link in the description to the Wikipedia article, so you can read a little bit more about it. It's in the Louvre. Why is it in the Louvre? Because it was found by Clermont Ganneau, so of course. But it was actually found in Dibon, in an area which was then, at the time, controlled by the Ottoman Empire, but there were the Bedouins there, and the Germans found it, and then the French bought it, and there was a lot of political fighting, and the Bedouins were really upset, and they wanted to make sure to basically retaliate against the Ottoman Empire for selling to the German and so on, so they shattered and broke it. Lucky for us, before it was shattered and broken, Clermont Ganneau was able to make a squeeze, which is the image you're looking at now. In other words, to take a piece of paper, to squeeze it on to the stela and to trace it with a pencil of some sort, and to get the words off of it. And he was able to rescue it because when he came back, it was broken. But thanks to this squeeze, he was able to reconstruct the pieces. Now, what's important about this is part of the reconstruction. What's important about the reconstruction is that the Mesha Stela actually is the only Moabite inscription we have, and it opens up saying, Ani Mesha ben Kemosh Hadivni Melech Moab. Like, whoa! So we talk about Kemosh Shikutz Moab. Kemosh is the god of Moab, so he calls himself the son of Kemosh. He is from Dibon, and he goes on, and he talks about the background to what made him fight, the background to the story. He talks about Bnei Gad who are sitting in Atarot. He mentions Shevet Gad, and according to one of the newer readings from the past few years, a new epigraphic study of the words. There may even be a mention of Beit David in this piece that I'm showing you right now. But the point is that it's talking about the background to a story in Tanakh, and it's the characters, it's the names, it's the cities. There's many important cities that are mentioned from Ever HaYarden that are important here. I can't go into it, but you're going to see it hopefully in the description. So the Mesha Melech Moav, the Moabite stone, that is in the Louvre in Paris. Let's get into the next highlight. This is a very, very important one, and I've been teasing you with this one for a very, very long time. Chazael Melech Aram, the king of Aram, who according to the Tanakh was appointed by Eliyahu Hanavi as part of his last assignment. Lechu mashachtat Chazael lemelech al Aram v'etihu ben Nimshi lemelech al Yisrael v'elisha ben Shafat timshoch lenavi tachtecha. Right, so he's involved in this transitional phase from Melachim Aleph to Melachim Bet. Chazael Melech Aram is the big new bad boy on the block. He's very bad for us, but he's not going to last for long. Now, we're going to talk about the Tel Dan Stella because we've mentioned that a lot. I'd like to remind you that there was this whole story at the end of Melachim Aleph with Kerem Navot HaYisraeli. Remember I mentioned the Jezreel Valley Winery. This is here in Emek Yisrael, and we're going to get here in just a moment. Emek Yisrael is this area in which the whole story is taking place, and this is one of the places where, again, this is using Herzog's HaTanach map. Using the map, you can trace the entire story and relate it to Kerem Navot HaYisraeli. So just to recap, that Navot, who lived in Israel, he's Navot HaYisraeli, had a beautiful garden right next to the king's palace in Emek Yisrael. And the king Achav really wanted that palace. His wife Izebel saw that he was very, very sad, and she said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." And they had him basically made up a coup, pretended that he cursed the king. They had him killed with false witnesses, and he took his field, his vineyard, and to which Eliyahu Hanavi came to him and he said, "Haratzachta gam yarashta, you murdered him and you're going to inherit him," which became a popular saying in Hebrew, Haratzachta gam yarashta. And so at this point, Eliyahu Hanavi says to Achav, "That's it, you're done. This was the last straw," and he really was crushed by that. He ends up, dying in battle and so on. So this is all going to come back together here. Now, here is Aram, and Chazael Melech Aram is coming to fight in the Battle of Ramot Gilad. You see where Ramot Gilad is, and we have our other players, which is Yehoram ben Achav and Achaziah ben Yehoram. And just to confuse things a little bit more, it's Achaziah ben Yehoram, Yehoram ben Achav, Yoram and Yehoram keep on getting switched. It's a confusing story. There's also several Yehoachaz, Achaziah. Let's just stick to the basic story, okay? We have Yehoram ben Achav Melech Yisrael, Achaziah ben Yehoram Melech Yehuda, and we have Chazael Melech Aram fighting in Ramot Gilad. Now what happens? In this battle, Yehoram ben Achav is shot by the Aramean archers, and he goes back to his palace in Emek Yisrael to recuperate, and he's there together with Achaziah. At this point, Elisha goes and takes Yehu ben Nimshi, who we mentioned, anoints him and says, "Go and catch up with Yehoram and get rid of him, kill him." Okay, and that's what happens. He gets rid of all of the evil that's left from Beit Omri Bet Achav, and so he catches up with him. And at that point, Yehoram realizes, "Oh no, I'm going to get killed," and he runs towards the area of the palace down in Kerem Navot in the field, and he is shot through the heart as he's riding, and he dies, and he gets killed, and his blood is splattered. Well, it's very gruesome. And at that point, it's sort of like a closed circle. It comes full circle in the place where the whole thing started with Kerem Navot HaYisraeli, and justice is served. And at that point, Achaziah runs away to Megiddo, and we're going to get to Megiddo a little bit later. And he ends up dying there, and he's taken back to Yerushalayim. And at that point, Yehoram goes back to finish unfinished business. And for those of you who have been following how many times we've seen a royal woman from the window, well, here is number 3, Izebel bat et Baal Melech Tzidonim. And this is the Phoenician woman from the window. This is Phoenician ivory. It comes full circle. She looks from the window, and she sees Yehu ben Nimshi coming towards her, and she puts on her makeup, her mascara. She wants to look really good. I guess he's trying to seduce him or something. And then she says to him, "Ha'atau ze zimri horeg adonav?" "Oh, you Benedict Arnold, you betrayer, you backstabber. Is that you?" To which Yehu says, "Is there anyone else there that I can talk to out the window?" And some guard goes, "Woohoo, I'm here." And he says, "Can you do me a favor and push the out the window?" And he pushes her out the window. She falls to a gruesome death, and these prophecies of the end of the house of Achav and Omri are complete. So that's the end of the story. And now to our massive discovery from the 1990s. And that is the Tel Dan Stella found here in Dan, which apparently was conquered by Hazael Melech Aram for a certain period of time. I mean, he was a king for decades, caused us a lot of problems. And on this stela, on this piece, the Tel Dan Stella, which was found in those words, I'm going to enlarge it here for you. In white, it says the words Bet David. Now, there is two important things about the Tel Dan Stela. Number one, it has the eponymous ruler, David HaMelech, the founder of the dynasty of the kingdom of Yehuda, mentioned, Beit David. This is the earliest and the first extra-biblical source that confirms the existence of a house of David. That's number one. Number two, Hazael, presumably it's Hazael, the king of Aram, is taking credit for killing a melech of Beit Omri and a melech of Beit David. In other words, this is our same story, but he's the one who's taking credit for it. So who do you trust? Who do you believe? This should give you an insight into archaeology and into propaganda and into what kings write about themselves and how truth is always, well, history is always written by the victor, whoever victor is. And on that note, I just want to say that from here, while Aram perhaps was a big fish, but you know the story of small fish gets eaten by big fish, gets eaten by bigger fish? Well, Aram is going to be eaten by the bigger fish now because we are going straight into the age of empires. We're done with regional kingdoms. We're done with these. We are now moving on to the big and mighty biggest fish, the house of fish, Assyria, whose capital was in Nineveh, and Nineveh in Aramaic is Neve Hanun, means the house of fish. Indeed, their pictograph or hieroglyph actually is a fish inside a house. It's on the Tigris River, Nineveh. This is a reconstruction of the palace of Sancheriv. We're going to get there. We know about Nineveh from the story of Yonah. Let's go meet the big fish, Assyria, known also as the lion's den. Now, I'm going to say one thing about Assyria, and that is that there's a lot of links in the description, and we're going to get more into Assyria, Bezrat Hashem, when we talk about Yeshayahu, just as we're going to get more into Bavel when we get into Yirmiyahu. So some of this stuff is an overview, but we're going to have to save a little bit for it later because we're already taking long enough, and this is a jam-packed episode, but we really got to get into it. So, we are at the rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. What is the Neo-Assyrian Empire as opposed to the Assyrians? It's when the Assyrian kingdom was able to regroup, reorganize, restructure themselves under Tiglath-Pileser III. Tiglath-Pileser III to become the Neo-Assyrian kingdom. Now they are an empire. And they are an expansionist empire. They're aggressively conquering and deporting people throughout the ancient Near East, creating a massive empire, as we're going to see very soon on a map. Now, the first encounter we have with Tiglath-Pileser III is actually with Menachem ben Gadi, Melech Israel, who ends up paying him tribute, and that is actually recorded on this stela of Tiglath-Pileser in the Israel Museum. Isn't that exciting? In fact, there he's actually called Pul Melech Ashur, but Pul is Tugulti Pulu Usu, Tiglath-Pileser pronunciation. We're going to see more of those examples later. So this is in the Israel Museum. But now let's meet the case which really changed the dynamics in the ancient Near East, in the region. So our story, which is also showing up again in Yeshayahu and in Divrei Yamim, so we may be able to get back to it again. Achaz Melech Yehuda makes an alliance with Tiglath-Pileser Melech Ashur. He wants to bring him into the region. Now he is severely confronted and attacked by the local regional kingdoms who want to keep that foreign influence out. They did not know what was coming. And we have Ritzin Melech Aram, Pekach ben Ramaliyahu, and according to the Assyrian documents and records of this campaign, also Hiram, the king of Tzor, another one of the Hirams. It's a recurring name in that kingdom. And they all ally forces, Nacha Aram al Ephraim, they are there. They're about to try to destroy Achaz for his audacity to try to bring in this foreign Tiglath-Pileser. But unfortunately for them, Tiglath-Pileser comes and attacks them from the rear, destroying Aram, and destroying and deporting, Galut, deporting 2/3 of the entire population of Malchut Yisrael. And Malchut Yisrael is very soon going to be gone by the next kings of Assyria, who are going to come and completely deport everything that's left of them, and mass deportation. Before we get into the concept of mass deportation, I just want to mention that because the Assyrian Empire destroyed the kingdom of Aram, because of this particular story, I mean, they had on and on battles going on with Aram. We've mentioned the Kirk monolith with Achav in Melachim Aleph. That's also in the British Museum. But they eventually destroy Aram completely due to the story. and they completely mix them up and spread them and shuffle the Aramim throughout their administration and kingdom, which is why Aramaic became the second official language of the Assyrian Empire, who was then taken over by the Babylonians, and therefore it's an official royal language, and then the Persian, and so Aramaic became the language of the great empires to come because of the story, and so the Talmud Bavli, the Gemara, is written in Aramaic because that's the result of this story where the Aramaic was absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. Really cool. Now, Tiglath-Pileser comes in with his chariot, destroys the kingdom of Israel. This is from the British Museum. There's several good images of Tiglath-Pileser on his chariot with his parasol because, well, it's actually raining outside if you can hear it, but this is a different kind of umbrella. And this is a relief from the palace of Sancheriv in Nineveh from the Met public domain, and it shows you an example of the Assyrian attacking a citadel in the background, shooting up arrows, climbing up a siege ramp with all of their different types of war siege tactics, and in the foreground, you see deportees, golim, going into Galut. So let's talk about deportation a little bit, because we know that this is the hallmark of the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire specialized in deporting and shuffling massive amounts of population throughout their empire, which you can see was a massive empire, and that enabled them to control a tremendous amount of territory, because instead of you fighting to defend a foreign invader, you no longer have a homeland, you're part of the greater empire, and so it plays to their benefit. So this area shows you the different areas of their control. The green is the conquest of Tiglath-Pileser III, and then you have, which expanded greatly over time, and they eventually invaded Egypt, but that comes a little bit later. And you see that there's several different shifts, different arrows, different colors of Assyrian kings, emperors, who repopulated the area, shuffled them. They brought in people from Kuta and Selavan and brought them in to the Shomron. So we have the concept of Samaritans, right, who are repopulated. That's all part of the story. And this is why the 10 tribes are gone. Now, once the 10 tribes are gone, sufficiently repopulated throughout the ancient areas, and we don't have time to get into all of this story right now, the 10 lost tribes, where are they? At this point, Chizkiyahu HaMelech is pretty much left on his own. And as the next king of Assyria, Sargon II, dies, he takes the opportunity to rebel against the declining Assyrian Empire, or so he thought. So let's talk about Chizkiyahu HaMelech. From left to right, we have Chizkiyahu's personal seal, which was found right outside the Dung Gate on top of the City of David National Park. You can actually see where it was found today by just walking out the Dung Gate and taking the left, walking for a few minutes. And this seal, which is actually a bulla, in other words, the seal stamped into clay, which sealed a letter, says in ancient Hebrew, Lechizkiyahu Achaz Melech Yehuda, belonging to Chizkiyahu, the son of Achaz, king of Yehuda. So Chizkiyahu rebels against Sancheriv Melech Ashur by refusing to pay taxes. That's how you rebel. And one of the things that we find out is that he realized that the Assyrian Empire under Sancheriv, the son of Sargon, regrouped, reorganized, powerful than ever, and in the year 701 BCE, 2,700 years ago, they came, or Sancheriv, with his army, came on a punishing campaign to punish all of those people who dared to rebel against him, including Chizkiyahu. And Chizkiyahu is going to pay a very, very heavy price. Now, one of the things we found in many important administrative sites in the kingdom of Yehuda is these jugs. You can see one of them. This is in the Israel Museum, and it was found in Tel Lachish, but it has a seal a stamp on top of the handle with a winged beetle or a sun disk, which says on it in ancient Hebrew, Lamelech, belonging to the king. We've seen that with Achav earlier in the Telerikhov excavations. And then there's the name of 4 different cities. We have different variations. We have Zif, Mamshat, Socho, and Chevron. Lamelech, Chevron. These are known as Lamelech jug handles, and they are a hallmark of the kingdom of Yehuda reorganizing their administration to collect taxes to prepare for the Assyrian invasion, which is about to happen, or to just pay taxes to Assyria in the capacity of being a vassal state. Either way, these are 2 opinions. In archaeology, we have Chizkiyahu preparing for the invasion. And one of the things that he does in preparation is making a broad wall around the western part of the city, which expanded. That's the modern Old City. By the way, if you look at this image of the broad wall in the Old City, which was discovered after the 6-Day War because the city was in ruins and they just excavated to rebuild, my parents' house and my childhood home is right up these stairs, and I have a great video for you in the description where I walk down there like the old city, like a Rova boy would do, showing you all kinds of cool stuff you usually would never see even if you stood there, because I'm showing you the insider's view. This is my stomping ground for my childhood. So there's a great video. Check it out in the description. There's also articles and videos from Mechon Megalim. Lots of goodies. Another thing that Chizkiyahu did is Satam Megichon. He shut the main Bronze Age powerful fortress outside the city, where we saw that David HaMelech had Shlomo anointed, right? That's the Gichon. He had that shut to make sure, to prevent the Assyrians from finding the water source, redirected it underground into the old city. This is known as Hezekiah's water cistern. Some of you may have gone underground. It's about a half a kilometer underground in water. It's a lot of fun. And at the other end of it, when you come out, where my family generally would do tashlich on Rosh Hashanah, there is an inscription which is called the Siluan tunnel inscription, currently in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul upstairs. There's a replica now here, but again, this was found under the Ottoman Empire, so they took it. And this talks about that moment that the people who were doing the construction met from both ends and the water came gushing through. So this is part of the things which Chizkiyahu did in preparation for the invasion. Now, what actually happened? You're looking at the picture of the Assyrian siege ramp that was discovered in Tel Lachish National Park. Tel Lachish is actually in the Shfela, in basically about halfway between Ashdod and Beersheba. It's in the south. And it's a very powerful city. It's the second most important administrative city, and we're going to get back to Lachish a little bit later. Lachish was destroyed several times. It's a huge city. It's a very monumental city, and its destruction is world famous. And I'm going to tell you why in just a moment. Now, this one of the things that Sancheriv did when he came to attack Chizkiyahu, whose capital is Yerushalayim, is to destroy the entire coastline first. Why? Cut him off from supplies, demoralize him, and make sure that he has no backup and auxiliary forces when you finally come and close in on Yerushalayim. Now, we know that Sancheriv did not succeed in destroying Yerushalayim, but he talks about it. So, the first thing he does is he destroys all of that area and cuts him off from all the supplies and so on, and he destroys the city of Lachish. This is a famous picture of the famous destruction of the city of Lachish. Why is the destruction of Lachish so important? Ladies and gentlemen, that's because, speaking of biblical archaeology, the excavations in the early 1800s in Tel Kunyunjik, in Iraq, in the ancient city of Nineveh, was the first discovery of biblical archaeology. In 1847, the year before the production of the Communist Manifesto, that's like how I like to remember it, is when Austin Henry Layard, the British archaeologists, discovered the ruins of the palace of Sancheriv. And what do you think is decorating the throne room of the mightiest king in the world? The destruction of Lachish, of course. What else? Who would have thunk? And so these are just some images from it. Again, check out the videos in the description. Lots of good stuff. Megalim video. I was also there recently, and I took some videos myself. Check that out in the description. Very, very graphic, very illustrated of all the destruction of the city of Lachish, the entire battle formation, psychological warfare, you name it. And here's Sancheriv sitting on his throne. His face was carved off by the Babylonians when they came and destroyed Nineveh later, but that's part of what they would do to destroy his memory. But this is Sancheriv. There's an inscription there that says Sancheriv, the king of Assyria, king of the universe, sits on his throne as the spoils of Lachish are paraded before him. So this is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is the first biblical story of Tanakh ever found, and this basically kicked off what we know today as biblical archaeology. Now, Sancheriv was somehow stopped. According to the Tanakh, there was a Malach Hashem that came out. Hashem, we're going to talk about that more perhaps in Yeshayahu, but Hashem heard him crying. He sends Yeshayahu to tell him, don't worry, nothing's going to happen to you, and Sancheriv is going to go back home and get killed, as indeed we know happens. He gets killed in Nineveh. Now, Sancheriv writes about this campaign in this prism known as the Sancheriv Prism. There's three different ones. There's one in the Chicago Oriental Institute. There's the Taylor Prism and the Rassam Prism. So this one. So but there's 8 other ones in fragments, 3 fully intact. I got to see all 3 of them within 2 months. Israel Museum, British Museum, and Oriental Institute in the University of Chicago. And in this inscription, Sancheriv Melech Ashur discusses his campaign, how many cities he destroyed, and the tribute which Chizkiyahu eventually paid him to let him go. And he does not talk about conquering Yerushalayim. Instead, what he says is, as for Hezekiah the Judahite, I captured him in his city like a bird in a cage. Captured him like a bird in a cage. Did he conquer Jerusalem? No. Did he kill Chizkiyahu? No. But he made his point. He made his point. And he kept him subjugated to him. He didn't annex Jerusalem. Apparently, it wasn't worth the effort at the time. He made his point. Chizkiyahu said, Chatati, sur me'alai et asher tomar eten. And in fact, you can see the same number of talents of gold and silver in the inscription and in Tanach. It's beautiful. Check out the video. Doron Spielman does an excellent job explaining it. And the idea is, why do you decorate your throne room with Lachish? Well, you didn't really capture Jerusalem. Second best. So you lift up your losses, your gains, and you play down your losses. He's captured like a bird in a cage. He ain't going nowhere, which is Assyrian lingo for mission not fully accomplished. So that's kind of cool. And one last thing, and this is going to be a real teaser, is the Black Pharaohs. And this is that there's this curious story that shows up in one pasuk where Chizkiyahu is told by Yeshayahu that V'shama Shmu'a v'shav le'arotzo, that Sancheriv is going to hear some kind of rumor and go back home and get killed there. What is the rumor that he hears? He hears that Tirhaka, the king of Cush, comes to fight him, and then he goes and he's distracted and he's gone. What are we talking about? Check out the article down below, and I hope to get to that a little bit later, maybe in Yeshayahu. It's a great article. I called it Taharka Sencheriv Chizkiyahu, The Untold Story. Check it out in the description. It's a great story. So, before our last highlight for today, which is Bavel, we have one transition, which is the Battle of Carchemish. And here is where we talk about the last great king of Yehuda before it's all downhill, and that is Yoshiyahu ben Ammon. Yoshiyahu ben Ammon is known as perhaps the leader of the greatest Teshuvah movement the world has ever seen. He really had it going, and he ended up getting killed as he tried to obstruct Paro Necho on his way to Carchemish al Nehar Pirat. Now, why is this battle important to us? Because at this point, the reason, the rationale why Yoshiyahu was able to be so successful and independent is because the Assyrian Empire was on the decline. Egypt was already very weak. Check out my article where I talk about how they became weak and how they were invaded by their enemy Assyria. But at this point in Tanakh, if you read the story, it kind of sounds like Egypt is going through Eretz Israel in order to fight Assyria, which makes sense because they're enemies. But when we know archaeology, it's actually different. They are joining forces against the biggest bully on the block. Now, before we get into that on the map, the point is there is a power vacuum, as Oded Lipschitz of Tel Aviv University calls this period. And since there is a power vacuum, Yoshiyahu actually had the opportunity to rebuild. And had he not gotten involved in foreign affairs, getting involved in the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, 2,600 years ago, we may have had a chance to rebuild. And this is what Yirmiyahu cries about. We're going to talk about that. So, here's Mitzrayim, we have Paro Necho, here's Nineveh, and here's Bavel, and they all coalesce here in Carchemish to battle. The only problem is that on the way to Carchemish, Yoshiyahu decides to stop Paro Necho, who actually just goes through him, and he says, why are you even fighting me? I have nothing to do with you. I have no quarrel with you. Let me pass. And Yoshiyahu gets there, and he says, you shall not pass. And he stops him there in Megiddo. And you can see in this video here from Tel Megiddo National Park, it's a massive site. Of course, it's far away from Jerusalem. It's not where you're going to block Paro Necho. You're not going to block him by Jerusalem. You're going to bottleneck him by Megiddo, thinking that you have the power of Megiddo to support you. But, sorry, but you don't. Now, the reason I mentioned Armageddon is because Megiddo, the Battle of Megiddo, Armageddon is a mistranslation. There's a whole story where Gog and Magog is mistranslated as Armageddon, where it's really Megiddo. So, it's just fun because Megiddo has to do with Armageddon, and this really was the end of Malchut Yehuda, because from here it's all downhill. Yoachaz, Yoyachin, Yoyakim, Tzidkiyahu, it's all downhill. We're vassals to Egypt and then to Bavel, and it's all over. So this is the story of Yoshiyahu who gets killed, and in terms of Paro Necho, we have lots of finds that have to do with Paro Necho. So on the top here we have seals of cartouches, of the symbols, the names of Paro Necho found in Carchemish. We have a statuette of Paro Necho in the Brooklyn Museum, which I've seen, and this as well I've seen in the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. There's an image of Paro Necho on the right, serving the Egyptian goddess, cow goddess Hathor, as those or those bull horns and the sun disk, she's related to Chet HaEgel, as we mentioned. So this is the Battle of Carchemish, and this is when, due to his involvement in foreign affairs and not listening, not heeding to the warnings of Yirmiyahu Hanavi, Yoshiyahu meddles in foreign affairs, brings in Egyptian control, who's then taken over by Bavel as they win the Battle of Carchemish, destroy Assyria, obliterate Egypt, and then it says indeed, V'lo yasaf od melech Mitzrayim letzet me'artzo, Egypt no longer leaves their country. Ki lakach melech Bavel kol asher haya lo min nahar Mitzrayim ad nahar Prat. Bavel is now the biggest bully on the block. They're the new empire. And so let's talk about Babylon. And before we do, I want to mention the 7 wonders of the ancient world recorded by Greek travelers and historians, and they talk about Babylon as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So hold on to that thought. British Museum again, ladies and gentlemen. There is a brick with a stamp name of Nabuchuduri Usur. If you were wondering why Nebuchadnezzar is sometimes written Nebuchadrezzar, it's because Nabuchuduri Usur, the god Nabu, gave me a first son. Nabuchuduri Usur. Kind of cool. So Nebuchadnezzar, it's a pronunciation thing. This is a brick with his name inscribed on it. There were many of those. And on the right here we have what's known as the Babylonian Chronicle, which is a clay cuneiform tablet in which Nebuchadnezzar lists month and day of the month in which he campaigned on his way towards Yehuda with all of the things he did on the way. We can trace the story of the Churban by reading these chronicles side by side, known as the Babylonian Chronicles. And there's a lot more to talk about in terms of this period of time, just so you know, from what actually happened in Yehuda, in Ir David. Tons of really, really good stuff, which we're going to get into Be'ezrat Hashem in Yirmiyahu, which is in 2 episodes from now. So hang in there, and I hope you click the like button by now and check out the description for lots of articles and videos and fun stuff. Now, so this is in terms of Nebuchadnezzar. But remember that Nebuchadnezzar comes and, just like Sancheriv, he doesn't immediately destroy Jerusalem. First of all, he goes through the coastline. That's the siege tactics. That's the psychological warfare. That's cutting them off from supplies and other military. And one of the things that he does is he destroys Lachish and Azekah, ki hema notru beYehuda arei mivtzar, as it says in Yirmiyahu. I think it's Perek Lamed Zayin. So Lachish and Azekah fall, and Lachish, as we saw, was destroyed by Sancheriv, decorates his throne room. But this Ostracon, which is a piece of clay written in ink, there's a whole bunch of them found, and they're in the British Museum. This is Lachish letter number 4. That's just how they cataloged them. They just numbered them. And you can read the Hebrew on it if you just switch it to modern Hebrew. And the end of this letter says, we are protecting the bonfires, the signal fires of Lachish according to all of the defined symbols, whatever it is, the communication, because we can no longer see Azekah. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there's different interpretations of what this means. It can be just in terms of the topography that you can't physically see it on a rainy day, on a cloudy day, whatever, you can't see Azekah. But Lachish and Azekah are sentinels. They're the most powerful cities that are protecting your way into Yerushalayim from the coast. And so, according to some of the interpretations, Kiloni Re'et Azekah means Azekah is down, we're next. You are watching the Churban step by step. You can feel the shivers running through you when you read this. It's really, really moving. And so this is known as the Lachish letters, Michtevei Lachish. And now I would like to take you to the Ishtar Gate of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, which didn't make the final cut because Nebuchadnezzar's other thing, which is the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, did make it to the final cut. But this was one of the contenders. The Ishtar Gates, which are now in Berlin, painfully reconstructed from the excavations in Iraq, and there was a special exhibition about it in the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, known as ESAW, which is across the street from the Metropolitan Museum, which was the wonder of Babylon and how they made this and the craftsmanship and so on and so forth. But this is a beautifully constructed, magnificent gate with lions and dragons and bulls, each one representing different gods. So the lion is Ishtar, which has to do with Asherah and Ashtoret, as you know, that's one of the goddesses. The dragon is Marduk. If you know the name Mordechai from somewhere, well, hang in there because we're going to get there later. And the bull is Baal or Hadad or Bel, whatever you want. It's the thunder god. So what was the purpose of this gate? This is the gate coming in from the north into Bavel, and that's the way we would parade people coming in. This is the first thing we saw coming into Bavel, and so there's many reconstructions of the New Year's parade and so on, but the point is that the captives of Yehuda were led through these gates. Now, before I get to my most final point, an exciting point, which is going to really pull this all together, I want to share with you a cuneiform tablet discovered by the Ishtar Gates in the British Museum. And connected to the end of Sefer Melachim Bet. Melachim Bet ends with the psukim talking about in the 37th year of Galut Yehoiachin, the next king, the successor of Nebuchadnezzar, his name is Emil Marduk or Evil Merodach, uplifts him from jail, treats him well, changes clothing, gives him high status, and gives him a stipend, and at the royal banquet he feeds him to the last day of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, we found the recipe. This tablet lists Yehoiachin, the rations of daily oil given to Yehoiachin and his children, which we didn't even know who his children were there, how many were. It's listed. We found it. Really cool. We found Yehoiachin. In other words, and in the end in Bavel, as we'll see in Yirmiyahu, things turned out to be better for us as opposed to Ashur, which dispersed us and spread us. Bavel let us settle there. They just wanted us to pay taxes and not to rebel. As long as you don't rebel, everything's going to be fine. And things were good for us in Bavel. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the moment we've all been waiting for, the Ishtar gates. I said this is going to be very exciting for me because my whole journey doing tours in the Metropolitan Museum and now around the world and virtually, and my connection to doing this video and working for a second year with Tanach study, this is my very first tour in the Metropolitan Museum, my first tour, and this was a tour with Tanach study where we stood underneath these two lines from Nebuchadnezzar's Ishtar gate, which we saw as Jesse read Al Naharot Bavel, the Tehillim which talks about by the rivers of Babylon. So this was a very emotional and exciting moment, and I'm really excited to share this moment with you. So thank you very much for watching and for hanging in for a very long episode. I'm afraid to even check how long this took, but that's all I got for you for today. So I want to thank you very much for watching and to encourage you to like, comment, subscribe, check the show notes, check the links in the description, follow us, and I will see you next time for another episode of Tanach Study, Sefer Study, Archaeology Snapshot on Sefer Yeshayahu.